Doing a little video today on warm season native grasses, pollinators, with a little bedding discussion as well as predicted movement. This is a time of year where a lot of people are already starting to dormant seed if you're in a NRCS program, or maybe you're not even in an NRCS program, but you're just trying to improve habitat for wildlife. Or other goals that you're maybe trying to accomplish, bee pollination, birds, you name it. So, the number one mistake I see consistently is people don't plan ahead. They don't plant ahead to help achieve success on these warm season plantings. What a lot of people will do, and what I strongly recommend, is planting things that you can control the weeds the year in advance. And also where you're not leaving way too much residue. So, for example, corn is pretty commonly done, and soybeans are pretty commonly done. So, even though I'm not a huge advocate for glyphosate, this is one of these cases where it's pretty simple. You plant a crop that you can spray glyphosate, or again, there's other products that give you some residual, but you got to be really careful on some of these products because there's some residual herbicides that could have a restriction of 9 months, 12 months after application. So, so for example, if you're planting soybeans, you basically, in a lot of cases, whether you're no-tilling or working the ground, pre-plant, this is one of those cases, even if you lightly work the ground 1 to 2 inches deep, encourage some weeds to grow. So when you plant the beans, even if a no-till planter, you're going to actually flush some of the weeds in that soil and encourage them to grow. We spray them off post-planting. And even when it gets to be later season, or if there's stubble, for example, that the deer hammered those beans off, or maybe there's still a lot of standing beans when it gets to be later season, and you're seeing a lot of weeds there. As long as your soil temperature in that 60 to 80 degrees, the weeds aren't dormant, they're actively growing, you can do a late application of herbicides. Some of you guys that pay attention to the farmers that are crop farmers, you might see them going out and doing a late season spraying of weeds. And that's one other option that very few people do, but you could, but weather permitting. So there's other options you could do depending what your predominant weeds are. Are your predominant weeds grasses? Are they annual broadleaves? Are they tough to kill broadleaves? And that could dictate what you plant. If you have a lot of grasses, you don't want to be planting a grass smother crop. You'd like to be planting, a blend. Some people love your buckwheat options. I like to have a little bit more diversity in some cases too, but buckwheat is one option. Annual clovers are another option. They can grow really fast. You can control weeds after planting if you plant those in the spring with Buterac 200 Basagran and some broadleaf killers, Bucktrill, Brox, things like that. If grass is your predominant weed, especially when you're planting warm season native grasses, that makes it a little bit more trickier. So, for example, some grasses don't even, like quackgrass, don't die real effectively with using glyphosate. So even if you're doing a corn planting, bean planting, wherever that planting is, if you have grasses, depending on the type of grasses, don't go with that 1 quart per acre, 1.5, 2 quarts per acre. My recommendation is 2 quarts per acre glyphosate. But even better in cases like that is you use your glyphosate, but you spike it with like 8 to 16 ounces of clethodim. I tend to tell people to do that higher amount of clethodim, do 12 to 16 ounces. Why take a chance? Do a great kill on those grasses the year before planting. So you got a bean field, let's just say that you flushed some weeds, sprayed them off, controlled it. Maybe you don't even have a late flush of weeds there that you have to worry about. After gun season, bow season, dormant seeding is very common. You can drop seed there, depending on the part of the area of the U.S. you're at. Anywhere that gets snow, that's great to get snow on top. I mean, I tend to tell people to go out there right before snow hits and get that seed down, let the snow get on top of it, let Mother Nature do the job with freezing and thawing. You could also do some frost seeding in the northern reaches. Those are typically done February through mid-March. In the transition zones, we tend to move that ahead a couple weeks. And in the deeper south, you might not have good freezing and thawing action. Your best bet might be no-tilling and broadcasting drag harrowing in. So, real life story. One property that I help manage, I had somebody come in planting a name brand switchgrass blend. I had very poor take, and this is something that I see quite a bit in other cases. Depending on the soil type, do you have sand ground, and do you have peat ground? Do you have really light texture soils? People tend to bury these native grasses, switchgrass blends, pollinators in that too deep. They only need to be an eighth to quarter inch deep if you're drilling or working in the ground, drag hair in the ground. That's one huge case of failure. And so I believe we saw this in that same property where we were battling a couple different blocks for a number of years. I talked to a landowner who had talked to somebody that has planted hundreds of acres of switchgrass and has done this practice. And I did it myself this year. I actually took my plot master out before the warm season native grasses broke dormancy, went out there and just lightly worked the ground with the plot master. And what I believe happened is we encouraged a bunch of those dormant seeds, the dormant switchgrasses and warm season grasses there to actually find the light of day and grow and flush. And in those couple areas there, I saw a lot better growth in the previous years. And so, I don't know, I mean, you might call it disc seeding of sorts. I mean, seed is effective when placed at the depth that it should be placed. So again, what I did is one other project a couple years prior to on that property, because the timing got busy. It was like, I think it was one of the first, like around June 2nd, 92-degree weather. I was going to drop seed with my plot master, drag and roll it in. The power cord broke on the plot master. I ended up using earthweight bag seeder. Walked 15 acres in 92-degree temps. And what I did then is I just grabbed a really heavy drag harrow, aggressive drag harrow, but instead of using the aggressive side, flipped it over on the less aggressive side. And again, reminding people this is lighter, sandier textured soils. And I hooked it on the back of my Chevy pickup truck and drove about 25 miles an hour across those 15 acres. The goal was to just fluff up the soil, mix the seed with the soil, but try to keep it as close to the surface as possible. Eighth inch, quarter inch, for sure, no more than half inch deep. And it actually worked really well. I've shared some of those pictures different times with people in different forms of social media, my team members, and things like that. So again, so many people think you need to have really expensive equipment. You got to have no-till drills. You got to, and again, my other word of caution is I've seen this a lot too. You could have a Genesis drill. You could have a different, any kind of a Great Plains no-till drill. And again, how easy is it at times to get seed too deep with those heavier pieces of equipment, right? That's my challenge. You want to test this out ahead of time, no matter where you're planting, whatever the type of soil, is making sure that your seed placement, no matter what the type of equipment, no matter what the technique it is, to get it into the effective zone and not too deep. Planting too deep is your second most common, in my opinion, reason for failure with warm seasoned products. And again, if you're talking food plots, number one most common problem for failure. So, calibrate your drills, test them out. Also think about, this is something I've seen at times in the past over the years. I've been doing this for 30 years. I've seen just about everything I think anybody can see. And so here's something. If there's slope, very common, you could have slope. The deep, the more slope you have. If you got that heavy equipment, you got no-till drill. If you're on your bottoms, how deep is those drills planting? If you're on the side hills, How deep is some of those drills planting? I've been on properties. I went out there where landowners said, "Hey, it looks good in the bottoms of side hills. We look really poor." Also, somebody I worked with in the deep south, they showed me some pictures of a situation like that. Um, Shared on social media. I'm like, I know what happened because it's side hill. So again, take that into consideration when you're planting. Again, might be shallower planting on the side hills, much deeper on the bottoms, especially if you have some lighter texture soils, peat ground, marsh ground, things like that. Something to think about. So here's another strategy that I talk to people about if they haven't, if they're not 100% sure, well, or highly sure that they haven't cleaned up broadleaves, and they want to plan a warm season blend like the CP42, CP25, butterfly and hummingbird, one of the pheasant deer, shorter grass warm season bedding options. Plant straight native grasses in the spring, early summer, and then you could still spray off with some of your broadleaf killers post plant, and then come back in with the pollinators, dormant seeding, frost seeding after the soil temps are below 55 degrees, November, December, depending on where you're at in the U.S. That's a strategy I'll be doing myself on some land in 2023. I've been discussing that more with people because then it gives you more flexibility. If you get a flush of broadleafs in late June, early July on a lot of these warm season pollinators, then you're limited to how you can control those weeds except for just clipping. And that's another thing I'll bring up right now while I discuss that. So many people plant and leave, and again, there's a lot of guys that have turned to clipping one or two times post plant, basically trying to prevent any of these weeds that have flushed from producing viable seed heads, because all these warm season products are slow to establish. Why is that? Because they're developing below the ground. Anything that lasts a long time grows slowest. Anything that's not supposed to last very long will grow quickest. Whether it be warm season grasses, pollinators, or even things like really long lasting clovers, for example, or alfalfa, they're developing roots for survivability. They're doing that first in favor of above ground growth. So clip your plots. And some people might say, well, how can that, I really want to have some cover this year. Okay, here is one other option. And again, this can limit you as far as clipping to a point. There's certain products you could be using, which I've had a couple customers be really effective the last couple of years, establishing warm season pollinator bedding mixes as they've added a nurse crop to it. What kind of nurse crops could you be adding to it? So again, if your weeds are predominantly broadleaves that you might still have to spray, you could be using a forage sorghum. You could be using something like Egyptian weed. I have an option, called Fortress that we also will add, at a little bit lower rate. We don't want it to be too thick. We don't want to be acting as a smother crop, preventing effective establishment year one with warm season grasses. But we could go with a half to 2/3 rate of a structured product to give some structure year one, act as a nurse crop. We basically would clip that off the following, February, maybe one clipping. Depending where you're at, the way farther north you get snow on the ground, maybe it's like an April clipping, something like that. But that's something that is an option for people, is to use a nurse crop on warm season. NRCS programs, what's very commonly recommended as another nurse crop option, is more of a cool season option. And again, it might be more effective if you're going to still do at least one clipping, is what do you see on most of these contract programs? 50 pounds of oats recommended as a nurse crop at establishment. There could be some advantages of using that program as well, because especially if you're broadcasting, dragging seed in, or cold packing it, though the oats basically can act as bulk, because a lot of especially on the pollinators, and even things like some of the non-switchgrass native grasses, those are lighter, they're bulky, and they're harder to get spread effectively, dropped effectively, et cetera, et cetera. That extra weight from the oats can help that seed flow or distribute if you're doing a broadcasting technique. To get good effective coverage. You get some really quick establishment of the oats, which helps act as a smother crop. And again, oats matures in about 60 days. And again, full rates of oats is about 100 pounds per acre, 3 bushel an acre. So we're talking about only using like a half rate. If we use too much, it can get too thick. It can do too much smothering. And again, it might be a good strategy to go out there and clip off those oats, clip it off one time, maybe day 50, post-plant, depending on what your scouting tells you as far as if there's other weeds that are growing, back in that new establishment. Could it be a little sooner? Sure. And basically, we're maybe taking half the height so that we're not clipping too short to the ground. If there is a good early flush of establishment on the warm season, grasses, or if in some cases, if it's a pollinator or native grass type blend. Here's my one little thing I'll bring up to people. I see this almost every day on social media because there's a couple people out there that are really good in some things that they do, but they talk about just straight switchgrass plantings. And so again, I'm going to say this is my opinion, but again, in my circle of trust, I work with a lot of guys, NRCS agents, habitat managers, people that aren't selling any product. They're consultants. They're working one-on-one with people. And I would like to think I'm one of those people, and I get on a lot of properties. Been on about 250 properties in the last 4 to 5 years, and a number of them have had switchgrass products out there. Straight switchgrass. I see it, but I also ask people, especially if you're talking bigger blocks of switchgrass, how many deer are bedding out on your switchgrass, straight switchgrass areas? And reluctantly, people might say, well, I don't really see a lot of deer bedding in it. Okay, here's my next question. How come you don't see straight switchgrass recommended by NRCS agents? Okay, time and place for everything. Straight switchgrass can be really good for blocking, really good for directing deer, and really good for predicted movement. But if you're talking, and not that you can't plant a little bit of it on edges of pollinators, more diverse beddings. So again, for people that just, ask me or they read and they listen to people say, well, I'm going to plant 10 acres straight switchgrass. The people that do this for a living day after day, that work with a lot of end users, generally it's not as effective. That doesn't mean deer will never bed in straight switchgrass, but again, there's a lot of other options that are better. And so again, what I tend to recommend is a diverse blend of switchgrass, big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, side oats. Can use Canada wild rye. What is that? It's basically an offshoot of one of the most popular NRCS blends. And again, you can modify it to get a little bit more height, add an extra pound an acre of switchgrass to it. That's very commonly done. Could you add 2 pounds of extra switchgrass to it? Sure. In my opinion, I tend to like to be under that 4 to 4.5 pounds of straight switchgrass. Huge Indian grass fan, huge big blue stem fan, not talked about a lot. Why is that? I believe I have an opinion, but again, that's up to you guys. Why do deer guys not talk about Indian grass and big blue stem, but the NRCS guys do? And again, temperatures. You want deer bedding to be cooler in the summer, warm in the winter. And again, I've done experiments. I've had thermometers out there, people standing side by side with different mixes, and showing what's the difference in temperatures. It could be as much as 3 degrees temperature difference if you got more diverse heights versus all tall, straight switchgrass or heavy switchgrass type planting. So anyway, in wrapping all this up right now, here's my talking points. Is don't overlook pollinators. Pollinators, some of the guys I work with that kill consistently some of the biggest bucks, the best effective bedding in a lot of cases can be a pollinator mix. There's some pollinators that can, for some of you guys that want height, there's a number of different pollinators that can grow taller than a lot of native grasses. And in 2023, just because I decided after doing this a number of years, I'm like, why not offer something like that as well that people can overseed into? If you want to overseed in some straight switch grasses, you're to get established, or into any of your other more diverse native grass mixes. Tall pollinators are a great option. In theory, it'd be better to have a diversity of heights of pollinators, some lower to the ground, because again, my thing I want you guys to think about is when deer are bedding on the ground, how low are they laying? When they're standing, how tall are they? how tall are they when they stand, how low to the ground when they're laying. Think about this. You guys go out there after season and go out there and lay down. Stand up in some of the natives you got and lay down and feel like a deer. Maybe the light bulb will come on. So again, moving forward here, we'll be doing some more research. We'll be sharing some of our research. We've done some different blocks and new improved varieties in 2022. We'll be planning here shortly next week on one of the research properties, 12 different blocks of a bunch of different varieties of switchgrasses, some different native blends, tall pollinator blends, and also, on some other properties. So again, we'll be doing a lot more research, not just to educate ourselves, but also educate you guys on the pros and cons. There's pros and cons about anything that you can do. You all have your own unique management styles, and you all have your own budgets, equipment, soil types, deer numbers. There's so many more factors that can come into play, which we'll be covering in another series of videos. But again, some basic warm season native grass pollinator food of thought from John with Grand Prairie Outdoors.